Here we are back in WebStorm. The product list controller that we're going to build is part of the product functionality. So let's navigate to App, Products, then New, JavaScript file. We'll call it Product List Controller. We don't need to capitalize the file name, just the controller function name. So we don't forget, let's add the script tag for this new JavaScript file now. We'll go to index.html and we'll add our product controllers. So there's our first one. Let's go back to the controller. And as per our steps, we'll start with the IFI, the immediately invoked function expression. Note that we added use strict as well. Next, we'll look up the module. We called the module product management. So we use the angular.module and pass in the name. That looks up that particular module. Now we can register the controller with the module. So we have a reference to the module. We can just type in .controller, and the first parameter is the name of the controller. Now we're going to use the controller as syntax, so we don't need the $scope injected into the controller. Since there are no parameters to the controller function, we don't need an array here. We can just define the function as the second parameter to the controller method. So we can declare our function directly here. Let's make one more little change. Instead of defining the function as the second parameter to the controller method, let's instead just pass in a reference to the function. So instead of the function here, we're going to type product list controller. That's going to be the reference to our function. Then we'll just create the function separate from the registration. And in this case, we need to give it a name. It needs to match this name here. So the controller method of the module takes the string name of the controller as the first parameter and a reference to the controller as the second parameter. And we can then define the contents of the function separately down here. I think that makes the function easier to read and work with, but it works either way. Now we just need to write the code inside the controller function. There are two things we need to do in this controller. We need to define the model for binding to the view and define the methods for any actions in the view. When using the controller as syntax, the model is defined on the this variable. So let's define a variable that references this. We're going to say var vm equals this. Defining this in a separate variable at the top of the function ensures that the code references the appropriate this. If you are familiar with this in JavaScript, it can sometimes provide unexpected results, especially within child functions. By assigning a different variable to this up front, that variable then can be accessed within any child function. As with many examples you will see, I am naming this variable VM for view model, but it could be named anything. We could name it product here. We then need to augment that variable with the model and any methods needed by the view. Let's start with the model. We need to define an array of products. We already have that array defined in the ng-init of the view. So let's cut that array from the ng-init and paste it here. So we'll go to our index.html file. We'll cut this products out of here. And we'll go to our controller and define vm.products equal, and there it is. We are now augmenting the VM variable with the model, which is our list of products. As you might expect, this code should be replaced with code that actually retrieves the set of products. We look at data access in the next module of the course, so for now this will do. Now that we have the data defined in our controller, the next step is to let the view know about the controller. To hook this controller to the view, we use the ng controller directive. So let's go back to index.html, remove the rest of this ng-init tag, and instead add an ng controller tag. And we'll specify our controller. We're using the controller as syntax, so we're going to add as and an alias. We are using VM here as the alias for the controller, but that could be any name. We also used VM in the controller itself, here. But that variable name and this alias do not have to be the same. Now that we have an alias, we need to change products to use the alias. So this is going to be VM.products. We don't need to change the other bindings because they are using the local variable here, product, not a property directly on the model. The application should now run as it did before. Let's give it a try. And there it is. Now that we have the application working with our new controller, let's take the next step. Let's provide a method to turn on and off the images. So I'm going to go back to the controller. First, let's define another variable on the model that tracks whether the images are currently shown. So we'll just add that to the bottom here. VM.showImage equals false. Then we can define a function that toggles that variable. We'll call that function toggleImage. So VM.toggleImage equals, and we'll define the function. So all this is going to do is inverse the Boolean. And there it is. So that function will toggle the showImage variable on or off. Now we can use that variable and call that method from the user interface. We can go to index.html, and let's start by changing the header of the image column. So instead of having a word here, let's make it a button. So we're using the button tag, defining it to be of type button, and we're defining ngClick. ngClick is another Angular directive. That directive is executed when the button is clicked. So when the button is clicked, we're calling VM.toggleImage, and since it's a function, we use the parentheses to actually execute the function. Notice the use of the VM alias here. That is needed because this method is part of the controller, and the controller uses the VM as its alias. Now we need to actually hide and show the image. We can do that adding the ngShow directive to the image tag. So here's our image tag, so we're just going to add ngShow. This code shows the image if the variable showImage on the model, if that's true. Otherwise, the image is not shown. Notice the right-hand side of the ngShow directive is not specified with the double curly braces. The double curly braces are used on the ng-source. When a directive expects a value, like ng-source, double curly braces are required when assigning it to an expression. If the directive already treats the right-hand side as an expression, then double curly braces are not required. Directives such as ngShow, ngHide, ngClick, and ngIf all expect expressions and therefore don't require double curly braces. So we have enough here now. Let's give it a try. So click the image button. There are images. Click it again. They go away. Hey, it works. Let's make one more change. It would be clearer to the user if the button said hide image or show image. So let's add an expression for the button text. So up here in front of image, we're going to say either hide or show. So if VM.showImage is true, that means that the image is currently shown, so we're going to add the word hide. Otherwise, we're going to add the word show. So here's an example of using a JavaScript expression inside the double curly braces. Let's give it a try and see if it works. There we are. So if we want to show the image, we click. Now if we want to hide the image, we click. And it works. But let's open the developer tools and see what is actually happening here. And notice by default we set show image equal to false, so it shouldn't show the image. We're going to click refresh, but notice that the images still came down. If the requirement was to hide the image to improve performance and cut down on data charges, our code here is not meeting the requirements. That's because the ng-hide and ng-show directives only affect the display, not the fetching process. Let's try ng-if instead. So if we change ng-show here to ng-if, and that's the only thing we're changing, ng-show to ng-if, and we're going to run again. Again, we bring up the developer tools and refresh the page. And this time, you'll see that it is not bringing down the images. When I click Show Image, only then are the images downloaded and displayed. Excellent. We have all the functionality we want. Are we done? Well, the UI doesn't look all that great. We don't have funding for a designer, but let's see what we can do with Bootstrap.